ways can I say the word read? Reading, read, reader. Hey viewers, happy December of 2021. This is going to be my last video of this calendar year. I might record a couple today though, but I think this is going to be the last one of 2021. I usually start off 2022 with a review of the previous year. I used to do that as the last video of the year in question, but lately I've been doing it as the first video of the next year. Either way, hello and welcome to a transitional period in our civic calendar. So for this video, I've been mulling over something tarot related for a little while, kind of wanted to do a video about it. So I thought, let's just do that now, get that out of the way. So for this video, I want to talk about this idea that if we are going to be intuitive readers, then we don't read the guidebook, which is an idea that I disagree with. I'm just going to say that right now. No two ways about that. So my thought is basically, when I've had conversations with people about this, I've heard people say this to me, that like, oh, I don't read the guidebooks because I'm an intuitive reader. It has made me wonder, and I've never wanted to like ask this of the people that say this to me, because it's not usually in a time and place to have a full-on discussion like this. So this is the time and place to start a discussion about things like that. But what I've wanted to ask is, do they think that people who have read the guidebooks are somehow not reading intuitively? And what I think is maybe the case is that we're looking at the two extreme ends of, do you read the guidebook or not? Where one end is you never even so much as look at the guidebook, and the other end is when you do a reading, you read out of the guidebook, which is not what anybody that I know who is a reader who reads the guidebooks is doing. So like I said, it's never really been the time or the place when this all of a sudden gets dropped in conversation to ask those people, is that what they think? Like, is that what they mean? So this might not be what they mean, or it might be. This is just an idea that I had, that there are two extreme ends here with this idea, and I think that actually most readers fall within the middle. For example, when I very first started reading, and even today, sometimes when I'm just reading for myself, I will do the reading the way I normally would, without referring to anything else other than what I have already learned and my intuition. But I might choose to look up a reading in a book if it is a guidebook that I particularly like what the creator has to say. And as of right now, in my time and experience with the decks that I have, the things that I own, that I work with, I will say, perfect example of this, a guidebook that I love to reference for myself. I never, let's say this right now too, when I'm doing readings for other people, I never get out the guidebook and read out of it. That's not a thing I do. That's not how I do it. But if I'm reading for myself, after I've done the intuitive part of the reading, if I feel like I want to cross-reference or maybe just see what else the creator has had to say, Spacious Tarot. Because I love what Carrie has to say in the little booklet that comes with this deck. So often, after I have done a reading for myself with this deck, I will then go back and see what Carrie said, because I freaking love what Carrie wrote in the book for this deck. It's always so, and I think it helps that the way that Carrie has conceived the meanings of these cards and the way that Annie has illustrated them tends to feed right into my intuition. Like, we tend to have some of the same ideas about the direction that we think the cards tend to go. So I think that's why I also like double checking with double checking feels like a weird thing to say, but yeah, I like referencing what Carrie has said too, especially if it is for myself, because sometimes I do want that little extra, like somebody else's voice, right? However, when I am the reader and I am the interpreter, I don't do that. However, I have already read the guidebook before I ever start reading with a deck for somebody else. So when I talk about this idea that, like, yeah, I read the guidebook and I reference it as I'm learning the deck, but then I don't actually use it when I'm doing readings, What I mean is that I am not getting out the book and looking up the meaning and telling somebody, oh, this is what this means, and when we just pulled it in your reading. No, I'm not doing that. However, I've already read it when I was starting to get to know the deck. So all that information is already boop in my head, and it's already part of the toolbox of symbols and meanings that I can then bring out when I do the reading. So when I say I've read the guidebook or that I read the guidebooks, I don't mean I read out of the guidebooks when I do a reading. How many ways can I say the word read? All the different forms of the word read. Read, reading, read, reader. But anyway, an example that I always like to bring up about why I find that so valuable is with decks that do a little something different. So a deck that I always love to use as an example of this is the Herbcrafter's Tarot by Letitia Guthrie and Joanna Powell Colbert, or Colbert. I'm not sure how they pronounce that last name. The guidebook for this deck is so good, and the way that they have conceptualized this deck is not intuitive. Like, I could pick up certain things from the cards just by looking at them, and of course I do. So typically what I do, by the way, I've done a video about like my process of getting to know decks, but I don't remember if I said this specifically, and I'll say it again anyway in case you didn't see that video yet. When I do get a new deck, I go through and I look at the cards first. I do get my first initial intuitive impressions from nothing other than looking at the art and whatever is on the card itself. So if there is a title on the card or keywords or anything like that, of course, that's part of my initial impression of the cards. But I do get that first impression of just the cards before I ever look at the book. Then I tend to read through the book, all of the informational parts that might come before or after the actual card by card. Here's the meaning of this as the creators intended it. Then I will go through card by card, look at the card, read about it, look at the card again, and what I'm doing is seeing, does that make sense to me? Does that deepen my sense of what I now get when I look at the card? Or do I not agree with something? So when I'm reading the guidebook, I'm not beholden to what the guidebook says. When I then do a reading with the deck, I don't have to, for example, memorize the guidebook so that I'm like, okay, well, what did these creators say because that's what this card means? I'm still intuitively deciding what it means in that moment and in context of that reading, because the meaning of a card can change from one reading to the next, one day to the next, whatever. So it's not that we have to remember what the guidebook says, but what I'm doing is seeing if there is anything that the creators intended to go into the meaning of that card, that once I know that, will then stick with me and will enhance what I can draw from when that card comes up in a reading. So here's why I like using Herbcrafters as an example. I am a pretty planty person. I am not the biggest, most experienced, most knowledgeable like herbalist that I know, for sure. I've got people that I go to who are like the plant people, the herbalist people who know way more than I do. But I recognize that I am a rather planty person. I grew up knowing a lot about local plants, working with plants. So I do know a lot of the plants that are featured in this deck already. And therefore I can draw an initial intuitive experience or impression based on my experience with that plant. So for example, when I started looking through the cards of Herbcrafters, and the first card, the Fool, is Dandelion, I went, oh my gosh, yes, I love this deck already because I have a relationship with Dandelion. Dandelion already means something to me in my mind. So when I then see Dandelion and the archetype of the Fool in tarot, boom, my brain immediately makes a connection. You might not be able to do that, however, if you don't already have a meaning in your head about what Dandelion is, who Dandelion is, what Dandelion is good for, how you have personally interacted with it. The other thing that really stuck out to me with this deck with my first look through is that there are several plants in this deck that I was not familiar with, that I don't know. This one, in fact, I still am not sure how to pronounce. I didn't think to look it up again, but Usnea, Usnea. This is a plant that I did not recognize, the name or the image. Now I can get an intuitive impression of something from this image, certainly. It looks like a wreath. There's snow on the ground. There's a candle in the middle. It gives me winter solstice vibes. It's got all these little things sort of stuck in the wreath, almost like birds have been making a nest and there's a feather here, which kind of adds to that idea. So can you get an intuitive meaning from just looking at a card, even if you don't know what the plant on it is? Yeah, of course. Is that a valid way of reading the cards? Yeah, of course. I wouldn't ever have to read about this plant in order to get some kind of meaning out of this card, right? You don't have to. This is not an obligatory thing. But I feel like I'm missing something if I don't then read, like, why did the creators choose this plant? Why is it the Hermit card? Why is it number 9? Why did they choose to depict it in this particular artistic way? So when you read the guidebook, this card, it then explains, is also known as Old Man's Beard. Okay, so that immediately, Old Man's Beard, Hermit archetype, that makes a connection in my mind that I will now never forget when this card comes up. And it mentions that it grows long and healthy from trees. Oh, okay, so now I'm getting a different picture of the plant in my head. Here, it has been woven into a round wreath shape on the ground, but this isn't how you would normally encounter the plant in nature. This is something that was done to it, either by birds or by a person, because there's crystals up here too, so you get the impression that, like, this was put this way for a reason. It doesn't naturally occur that way. All of that is adding to now what this plant means in a divinatory sense. And then they also mention in the guidebook that this plant is a good fire starter. That adds to it. So any of that information, I did not know that the first time I looked at this card. I still could get a reading off of this card without knowing any of that background information, but I feel like knowing the background information only adds to my toolbox. So that is why I love using Herbcrafters as an example, because they put so much thought into the guidebook for this. So I know some of you have the Herbcrafters Tarot, but for any of you who do not, or if you have it but you haven't looked at the guidebook, 1, I encourage you to do so. But 2, if you don't know, they very obviously put a lot of work into not only, like, why is Dandelion the Fool and why is Usnea, I'm going to look this up after, I want to know how to pronounce this, why is that the Hermit, but also throughout the minors, all of the plants have been put into categories as the numbers. So, like, all of the aces are a certain thing, all of the 2s, all of the 3s. The plants that are numbered each thing all have something in common. And you might not immediately perceive what that common theme is. You might, if you sit there and look at the cards long enough, because that's something that I always do when I'm looking at the cards. I look through all of them initially, just in a row. But then I'll look at all the 1s, all the 2s. I'll look at the whole suit, whatever the fire suit is altogether, whatever the water suit is altogether, if it's a system that follows that kind of elemental whatever. I'll look at the whole suit together to see, like, how does this tie together? What is the common thread with this suit? And then, like, what's common between all the 6s, all of the 9s, and so on? How does that relate back to the 9 from the major? And so on. So if you're looking at all of them, you might be able to puzzle it out, right? And be like, oh, all of these are trees. But I think that knowing what the creators of the deck chose to be the theme and, like, why they associate it with that number, bringing in the numerology aspect, again, that just enhances the way that I then read those cards going forward. So I love it. I have looked around at my stacks of decks to try to see if there's any other one that I want to bring up here as an example. And I don't actually own a copy of this deck, but a deck that I have been looking at a lot more closely lately and that I may get a copy of for myself in the future, but I did buy as a gift for someone, so I was able to read the guidebook before passing it on to them, is Raymond Buckland's Romani Tarot. So if this is the first video of mine that you're watching, or the first that you're watching of a certain category of my videos, you may or may not already know that I work at the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, which is currently on display in Cleveland, Ohio. So we have a display of the Romani Tarot. We have like a display version of the earlier printing, the Llewellyn printing of the deck. And then we also have an uncut sheet of the deck from the printer hanging up on the wall as part of our tarot display there. So I get to look at the cards very closely a lot, and I got to read through the guidebook recently. And so this sticks out to me because the Romani Tarot has something in common with several of the other decks that I do own, which is that it is based around a particular culture. And so you can look at those cards and get an initial intuitive impression off of just the artwork. Of course you can. That is really what we're doing when we're reading tarot, in my opinion. One of the major things is the art. And so I always recommend to people to make sure that they are getting a deck that the art will really speak to them, especially if you're just learning. But in general, you know, we want to have art that's going to speak to us because the art is what we're looking at that gives us the impression. I would be very interested to hear if blind or sight impaired people have a different way of doing this, because that's just something that I haven't really looked into. But for me as a sighted person, it's mainly about looking at the art and getting the impressions off of the art. But reading the guidebook enhances that because it tells me the backstory of those cards and the meaning of the symbolism that I can't always immediately just get off of looking at it without any further knowledge. So this especially is important, I think, with culturally based systems, because if we are not part of that culture, we may not be able to immediately glean the meaning of something. From friends who have this deck as well, Aquamarine 18, Laura, has mentioned, for example, there are like 7 or 8 different types of Vardos, the traveling wagons, depicted in that deck. And there is information in the guidebook about each different type, how they were used, what their significance is in the culture. And so even just that part of the art, you know, whatever Vardo is in the background, that has a different meaning if it's one versus the other. And that's not something that all of us have prior knowledge of. If it is something that you happen to already know, you might be able to pick that up just by looking at it without having to read the guidebook. But for those of us who don't have that, that's a very important step. So I say that it has that in common with several of the other decks that I have. I have a few other decks that are Celtic themed. And if you happen to have experience with Celtic symbolism and mythology, you might be able to look at a new Celtic themed deck and just automatically pick some stuff up without having to read the book. But if you are somebody who is not very well versed in Celtic mythology or symbolism, you might want to read the guidebook in order to be able to tell what the heck even is this thing on this card. You know what I mean? So again, like, I think we can always get an intuitive impression off of the art, and it's totally valid to just read that way. But for me personally, I feel like I gain so much more by reading the books, and there are so many things put into them that, like, the people who created that deck put thought into this, and they wrote this book to guide you through working with the deck and beginning to find your own way around it. And most of them will say, like, they're not expecting you to read the meaning out of the book, because that's not typically how we do it. But it is there to help you get acquainted with the deck and then start having your own experiences with it. It is there to kind of introduce you. For example, I was recently gifted a copy of the Wildwood Tarot by Mark Ryan and John Matthews. The art is by Will Worthington. And in there, Mark Ryan says the best advice he ever received about reading tarot was to read the guidebook, then meditate with the cards, then basically set the book aside and start having your own experiences. That is how I was always taught as well. Not constantly read out of the book and only rely on what's written in the book, but on the other side, also not ignore the book entirely and never read what the creators of that deck had to say about it, right? So there's a middle ground here. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of interested to know whether that's what people think when we say, like, those of us who read guidebooks. Is it that people think we're just reading out of them constantly? Or the thing that really gets me is, do people think that if you've read the guidebook, you are somehow not using your intuition when you do a reading? Because that's really what's been tripping me up. Because I'd be like talking to people about a deck, and I'd say something like, oh yeah, the information in the guidebook is so good, like talking about Herbcrafters or something. And they'd be like, oh, I didn't read the guidebook. I'm an intuitive reader. And I kind of just want to be like, do you think I'm not an intuitive reader? You know, like, that's what confuses me. Do people think that because I've read the book before, that I don't use my intuition when I read? Because I do. That's how it works. So yeah, very, very curious about that, and I just kind of wanted to get my thoughts out about that and give you a few examples. So if there are any good examples from your collections, those of you who read the guidebooks, are there any that really stand out to you as like, yeah, I'm so glad I read this particular guidebook because it enhanced my practice with that deck so much more? Because I do think there are decks that the guidebooks really don't tell you much different than the basics that you might already know. And you know, and that's a thing too. Like, if you've already studied the Smith-Waite style system, and then the only decks you get are Smith-Waite system type decks, maybe the individual guidebooks don't add anything else for you. So you can just start reading those decks without having read the individual guidebooks. But you do already have the basis of understanding of the Smith-Waite system. So to me, that counts as like having some kind of background information. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I guess I'm just not really sure. Like, I think there's a big spectrum of experience here. Like, there could be like, well, I've studied the Smith-Waite system and then I've never bothered to read the guidebook of any other Smith-Waite system deck because I already know that system. But to me, that's, you've already done that research, you've done that reading, you are using that information as part of your toolkit when you are then intuiting the meanings of that card in that context. You do have something to pull from. You're not completely going with no background information or study whatsoever. There has already been some study done. And then I think there is what I've been talking about this whole time, which is reading the guidebook for an individual book, for an individual deck, to get a sense of it as you start learning it. But then when you're actually doing the readings, it's just intuitive from there, but you already have that background in your head to pull from. And again, like, I don't memorize everything. There are definitely things that I forget, but there are also things that stick with me from a guidebook, and those are the things that I think are important, because I mean, they've stuck with me for a reason, right? So if I forget details from the guidebook, that's no big deal. We don't have to memorize every single word. We don't have to include every single word that the creator said when we do a reading. I think it's just there to help. And from the standpoint of somebody who just is a book reader in general, I don't think that these writers are putting so much time and effort into the really good guidebooks. Not talking about the ones that kind of just like basic stuff that you could find on Google real quick and are not really giving you any additional information, but the really good, like the really detailed guidebooks. Even this other one here, 2020 Visions, I featured this in a recent video that I did about the card of the day polls that I'm doing right now, because this goes through why Krystal chose each event from the year 2020 as each of these archetypes for the majors. It's a major arcana only deck, you know. So again, like, useful guidebooks. I don't think that these people put so much time and energy into the guidebooks so that people would buy their deck but never read their words. And so for me, it's also just like paying respect to the creation that is a given deck. So yeah, share your thoughts in the comments. whether you tend to read the guidebooks or not, or if you skim the guidebooks but don't bother doing word for word, or I don't know, what do the guidebooks add for you? Are you one of the people who has never looked at the guidebook in your life, and how does that work for you? Because I like I said, you can read that way. I don't think that's invalid. I just think that for me, I gained so much by reading the books that I feel like I would be missing out on layers of understanding if I had never looked at them at all. And it's okay if I forget some of those layers, because I think the ones that are important and that are meant to be part of my understanding of that card will stick. And as I revisit them and I continue working with them, new things will always come up.
And mainly, I don't think that the difference between our styles is that one is intuitive and one is not. Both of these approaches involve intuition.
This is just a very interesting, and every person's way of doing this is very personal and individual and unique. But it's so interesting to talk about and think about. And so, yeah. I just always kind of wonder, like, what are people's assumptions when we talk about, and I'm like, oh yeah, I like that guidebook. And they're like, I don't read the guidebooks. Do they think that I'm not using my intuition? Because I am. So, yeah. Thank you very much for watching and or listening to this video. I will see you next year. Until then, don't forget to be awesome. Blessed be, and goodbye.